Stop picturing them with swords. Forget the Holy Grail, the secret rituals, and the dusty legends of warrior monks charging across the desert sands. If you want to understand why the Knights Templar were hunted down, tortured, and burned at the stake on Friday the 13th, you shouldn't be looking at their Bibles. You should be looking at their balance sheets. The truth is, the Knights Templar weren't just soldiers of Christ. They were the world's first multinational hedge fund. They didn't just fight wars, they financed them. They invented modern banking as we know it: safe deposit boxes, checks, credit transfers, and even pension plans, centuries before Wall Street existed. They were the creditors to kings and the treasurers to popes. But in the world of high finance, when you lend more money to the government than the government can ever repay, you don't get a bailout. You get erased. This isn't a story about religion. It's a story about a leveraged buyout gone wrong. This is the financial autopsy of the Knights Templar. To understand the financial colossus the Templars would become, we have to analyze their initial public offering. It started in 1119 with a valuation of zero. Hugh de Payens and 8 other knights approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a pitch. They would protect pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads from Jaffa to Jerusalem. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. And they meant the poor part literally. Their early branding relied heavily on the image of 2 knights riding a single horse, a symbol of their austerity and lack of resources. However, in the medieval economy, piety was a commodity. By positioning themselves as the ultimate servants of the faith, they tapped into a massive market of donor guilt and religious fervor. They didn't sell a product, they sold salvation insurance. The real turning point came not on the battlefield, but in the boardroom of the Council of Troyes in 1129. Here, they secured the endorsement of Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of the era. Bernard wrote their Prospectus, a treatise called in praise of the new knighthood. This was essentially their marketing white paper. It validated their existence to the wealthy elite of Europe. Suddenly, donations didn't just trickle in, they flooded. We aren't talking about small change. Nobles who couldn't go on crusades themselves sought spiritual dividends by donating land, manors, and cold hard cash to the order. In a modern context, this was seed funding on a massive scale. The poor fellow soldiers rapidly acquired a portfolio of real estate across France, England, Spain, and Italy. They weren't just managing donations. They were building an asset base that would serve as collateral for the most sophisticated banking network the world had ever seen. The poverty in their name became a corporate slogan, while their reality became immense, untaxed wealth. They had successfully cornered the market on holy credibility, and they were about to leverage it into financial dominance. If the Council of Troyes was their seed funding, the papal bull of 1139, known as Omni Datum Optimum, was their total deregulation. Issued by Pope Innocent II, this document was the single most important financial instrument in Templar history. In modern economic terms, it granted them status as a sovereign entity, independent of all secular and ecclesiastical authority, except the Pope himself. Let's break down the economic implications of this document. First, it exempted the Templars from paying tithes. In a feudal economy where the church took a 10% cut of everything, this was an instant 10% increase in their profit margins compared to any other landowner. Second, and more importantly, it allowed them to receive tithes. They could collect taxes on their vast lands, but pay none to the local bishops or kings. This created a massive trade imbalance that favored the order above all other institutions. Furthermore, the bull granted them the right to build their own churches and bury their dead, meaning they captured the full life cycle value of their members and tenants, cutting out the local clergy entirely. They were effectively an offshore tax haven floating in the middle of Europe. They could move capital across borders without tariffs, fees, or royal interference. No king could audit them. No bishop could excommunicate them. They answered only to a distant CEO in Rome who was often indebted to them. This total lack of regulatory oversight allowed them to grow at an exponential rate. They became a state within a state, operating with a level of autonomy that modern corporations like Amazon or Google could only dream of. They had the perfect business environment: low overhead, tax-exempt status, and a monopoly on the specific service of holy war. This was the regulatory framework that transformed them from a charity into a financial juggernaut. It was also the seed of the resentment that would eventually destroy them, as local economies began to suffocate under the weight of Templar privilege. By the mid-12th century, the Templars had established the infrastructure of the world's first true multinational corporation. Their organizational structure was not feudal, it was corporate. They divided their operations into distinct provinces, similar to regional sales divisions, each managed by a preceptor who reported to the Grand Master. The genius of their system lay in the network of commanderies. A commandery was not just a fortress, it was a branch bank and a production center. In Europe, these commanderies functioned as agricultural powerhouses. They produced wool, wheat, and timber, generating the raw capital needed to fund operations in the Levant. This was vertical integration. They owned the farms, production, the ships, logistics, and the knights, security. Because they had branches in every major city from London to Jerusalem, they could solve the biggest problem of medieval travel, the risk of carrying cash. A pilgrim or merchant could deposit gold at the Temple Church in London and receive a coded letter of credit. They could then travel to Paris or Acre, present the letter, and withdraw the equivalent value in local currency. This sounds ordinary to us, but in the 1100s, it was revolutionary fintech. It eliminated the risk of robbery and solved the problem of liquidity. The Templars charged a transaction fee for this service, of course. While usury, charging interest, was technically banned by the Church, the Templars found creative loopholes. They would disguise interest as administrative fees or manipulate the currency exchange rates between their branches to ensure a profit. If you deposited pounds in England and withdrew livres in France, the exchange rate was set by the Templar treasury, ensuring the house always won. This network effect meant that money didn't just sit in their vaults. It moved, and every time it moved, the Templars took a cut. They became the circulatory system of the medieval economy, and soon, kings found that they couldn't wage war or even run their courts without tapping into the Templar vein. With their physical network secure, the Templars expanded into custodial services. Their temples in Paris and London were built like fortresses, literally. The Paris temple had walls thick enough to withstand a siege, making it the safest place in France. Naturally, the wealthy elite began to use the temple as a safe deposit box. Crown jewels, wills, treaties, and tax revenues were all stored within Templar vaults. This accumulation of liquid assets allowed them to pivot to their most lucrative and dangerous business model, sovereign lending. They became the bankers to the crown. When a king needed to raise an army quickly, he couldn't wait for the harvest tax to come in. He needed liquidity now. The Templars provided it. They advanced massive loans to the monarchs of England and France, often taking the royal crown jewels as collateral. In the 13th century, under King Henry III of England, the Templars were effectively running the royal treasury. They collected taxes on behalf of the king, audited the sheriff's accounts, and made payments to soldiers and suppliers. They weren't just lending to the government. They were operating the government's fiscal machinery. This gave them immense political leverage. If a king wanted to launch a campaign, he first had to check if the master of the temple would sign the check. However, lending to kings is a high-risk strategy. Unlike a merchant, a king has an army and the power to change the law. The Templars relied on the threat of papal excommunication to ensure repayment, but this safety mechanism was fragile. As they financed more wars, their balance sheets became loaded with sovereign debt, IOUs from monarchs who were increasingly cash poor. The Templars were practicing fractional reserve banking, lending out more than they had in reserve, betting that not everyone would ask for their gold back at once. It worked flawlessly, as long as the political climate remained stable. But as the 1300s approached, the geopolitical weather was changing, and the Templars were overexposed to a single, dangerous client, the Kingdom of France. By 1291, the Knights Templar faced a catastrophic existential crisis that no amount of gold could fix. They lost their market. The primary product the Templars sold to the European elite was the defense of the Holy Land. For nearly 2 centuries, donors had poured wealth into the order's coffers with the specific expectation that it would be used to hold Jerusalem and the Crusader states against Islamic forces. But in 1291, the city of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Levant, fell to the Mamluk Sultanate. The Templars fought bravely, with their Grand Master William de Beaujeu dying in the rubble, but the defeat was total. With the loss of Acre, the Templars were expelled from the Holy Land entirely. They retreated to the island of Cyprus, establishing a new headquarters, but the optics were disastrous. In the eyes of their shareholders, the kings and pious donors of Europe, the Templars had failed to deliver. They were now a massive, heavily armed standing army with no war to fight and no territory to defend. In corporate terms, their core business model had just evaporated, leaving them with massive overhead and a sudden lack of purpose. This idleness made them dangerous. A private military contractor without a contract is a threat to the state. The Templars were still collecting revenues, managing estates, and moving money, but without the Holy War to justify their privileges, their tax-exempt status began to look less like a divine necessity and more like a corporate loophole. Criticism mounted across Europe. Questions were raised. Why were the Templars still hoarding wealth in Paris and London if there was no crusade? Why were they not spending their vast reserves to hire mercenaries and retake Jerusalem? The order became a victim of its own bureaucracy. Instead of pivoting quickly, they grew insular. They continued to act as if nothing had changed, maintaining their arrogance and their strict secrecy. On Cyprus, they even began to meddle in local politics, participating in a coup against King Henry II of Cyprus. This was a fatal strategic error. It signaled to the monarchs of Europe that the Templars were no longer just servants of the Church. They were a rogue political entity looking for a kingdom of their own. If they could overthrow a king in Cyprus, could they do the same in France or England? The loss of the Holy Land didn't just hurt their pride. It stripped away their moral armor, leaving them exposed to the jealous eyes of a cash-strapped Europe. As the 14th century dawned, the pressure to restructure the military orders became intense. Pope Clement V, newly elected and acutely aware of the shifting political tides, proposed a logical solution, a merger. He suggested combining the Knights Templar with the Knights Hospitaller. The Hospitallers were the Templars' main rivals, but they had successfully pivoted. While the Templars remained fixated on a military reconquest that was increasingly unlikely, the Hospitallers refocused on their medical and naval missions, operating hospitals and policing the Mediterranean sea lanes. A merger would have created a unified superorder, streamlining costs and reducing the rivalry that had often hampered Crusader efforts. From a modern business perspective, this was a necessary consolidation of a saturated market. It would have saved the Templar brand, hidden their liabilities, and secured their political future. But Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Temple, refused. De Molay was an old soldier, not a politician. He was rigid, unimaginative, and fiercely protective of the order's independence. He wrote 2 memoranda to the Pope rejecting the merger, citing logistical incompatibility and the superiority of the Templar fighting style. This refusal was a catastrophic failure of leadership. De Molay failed to read the room. He didn't realize that the merger wasn't just a suggestion. It was a lifeline thrown by the Pope to protect the Templars from their growing list of enemies. By rejecting it, de Molay isolated the order. He positioned the Templars as an obstacle to church reform rather than a partner in it. Furthermore, his arrogance blinded him to the real threat. He believed the order was untouchable because of its history and its financial leverage. He thought the heavy debts owed to the order by kings effectively bought their loyalty. He was dead wrong. In finance, if you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. The kings of Europe, particularly Philip IV of France, owed the Templars massive sums. De Molay thought this debt made him powerful. In reality, it made him a target. By refusing to merge and dilute the order's identity, de Molay ensured that the Templars remained a distinct, monolithic target with a bullseye painted on their backs. He held on to the corporate structure of the 12th century, failing to see that the 14th century had no place for a sovereign paramilitary bank operating on French soil. To understand the destruction of the Templars, we must profile the man who pulled the trigger, King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. Philip was not a religious zealot. He was a cold, calculating technocrat obsessed with centralizing royal power. But Philip had a massive problem. He was broke. He had engaged in costly, grinding wars against England and Flanders that had drained the French treasury. The cost of medieval warfare was skyrocketing, and the feudal tax system couldn't keep up. Philip was effectively running a sovereign debt crisis. To stay solvent, he resorted to desperate economic measures. He aggressively debased the currency, reducing the silver content of French coins by nearly two-thirds. This induced hyperinflation, wiping out the savings of the merchant class and causing food prices to soar. The situation became so volatile that in 1306, riots broke out in Paris. The mob, furious at the worthless money in their pockets, besieged the royal palace. In a twist of supreme irony, Philip was forced to flee his own palace and seek sanctuary in the headquarters of the Knights Templar. For several days, the King of France lived inside the temple in Paris, protected by the very monks he would later destroy. During his stay, Philip saw firsthand the immense wealth of the order. He saw the vaults stacked with silver and gold, the efficient bureaucracy, and the sheer power of their network. It is said that this was the moment the idea formed. The Templars had the money he needed to plug the black hole in the national budget. Philip was already deeply in debt to the Templars. He had borrowed heavily to fund his Flemish campaigns. The Templars were his creditors, and they were becoming impatient. For a man like Philip, who believed in the absolute, divine right of kings, being beholden to a group of monks was humiliating. He realized that if he eliminated the lender, he eliminated the debt. But he couldn't just rob them. They were protected by the Pope. He needed a strategy that would circumvent the church's legal protections. He didn't need a bank robbery. He needed a legal expropriation. And to do that, he needed to turn these soldiers of Christ into enemies of God. The destruction of the Templars was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a systematic strategy of asset forfeiture developed by Philip's ministers, particularly the ruthless lawyer Guillaume de Nogaret. Before targeting the Templars, Philip ran beta tests of his state-sponsored theft on other vulnerable financial groups, the Lombards and the Jews. The Lombard bankers from Italy dominated the credit markets in France. In 1291, Philip ordered the arrest of Italian merchants and the seizure of their assets. He accused them of usury, lending money at interest, which was a convenient charge because it was technically a sin, even though the economy relied on it. This raid provided a quick injection of cash, but it wasn't enough. In 1306, 1 year before the Templar raid, Philip escalated his tactics. He issued a decree expelling all Jews from France. This was a monstrous act of cruelty, but financially, it was a calculated liquidation. Philip seized the property, homes, and goods of the Jewish population. More importantly, he seized their debt ledgers. He didn't cancel the debts owed to Jewish lenders by French Christians. Instead, he declared that those debts were now owed to the crown. He effectively nationalized the private credit market. This operation was a logistical triumph for Philip's bureaucracy. It proved that the French state now had the administrative capacity to coordinate mass arrests and asset seizures across the entire kingdom simultaneously. It also proved that the public would tolerate, and even cheer, the persecution of a wealthy minority if it was framed as purifying the kingdom. The Templars, watching from their high towers, should have seen the writing on the wall. The king was cannibalizing the financial sector to feed the state. But the Templars believed they were different. They weren't Jews or foreigners. They were anointed knights of the church. They believed their social proof and papal bull would protect them. They failed to realize that to Philip, they were just another balance sheet waiting to be liquidated. The raid on the Jews was the dress rehearsal. The Templars were the main event. The operation launched against the Knights Templar remains one of the most impressive feats of police work in history. It was the medieval equivalent of a synchronized FBI raid, executed without the aid of telephones, internet, or radios. On September 14, 1307, King Philip IV dispatched sealed letters to his bailiffs and seneschals across every district of France. The instructions on the outside were strict. The letters were not to be opened until the night of October 12th. Inside the letters were detailed orders to arrest every Templar in France at dawn on Friday, October 13, 1307. The secrecy was paramount. If the Templars had received even a few hours' warning, they could have mobilized their formidable military strength, barricaded themselves in their fortresses, and transferred their liquid assets out of the country. The French army, exhausted from wars in Flanders, would have struggled to dislodge the Templars from their fortified commanderies. The element of surprise was Philip's only advantage. The plan worked flawlessly. At dawn, royal agents stormed Templar residences, farms, and the massive Paris temple. The knights, many of whom were aging administrators rather than young warriors, were caught completely off guard. There was almost no resistance. In a single morning, the most powerful military financial organization in Christendom was decapitated. Thousands of men, knights, sergeants, priests, and servants were thrown into royal dungeons. The efficiency of the raid highlights how much the Templars had underestimated the French state. They were prepared for war in the desert, not a police action in the suburbs of Paris. Immediately following the arrests, Philip's agents began the inventory. They seized the archives, the ledgers, and the keys to the vaults. However, historical rumors persist that the great treasure Philip sought was never found. Some theories suggest the Templar fleet set sail from La Rochelle the night before, carrying the bulk of the gold. Whether true or not, Philip secured the most valuable asset: the control of the Templars' physical property and the suspension of their debt collection. He had successfully frozen the assets of his biggest creditor. Now, he had to justify it to the world. Arresting the Pope's personal army was a violation of every law in Christendom. Philip faced immediate backlash from Pope Clement V, who was furious that his jurisdiction had been breached. To survive the political fallout, Philip had to prove that the Templars were not Catholic monks, but secret heretics. If they were heretics, they lost their ecclesiastical immunity, and their property could be legally forfeited to the state. The burden of proof was on Philip, and he obtained it through the liberal application of torture. The interrogation methods were brutal. The inquisitors employed the strappado, where the victims' hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted into the air, dislocating their shoulders. They used fire, starvation, and the rack. Under this duress, the knights began to confess to the specific, bizarre charges Philip's lawyers had drafted. They admitted to spitting on the cross during initiation, denying Christ, worshipping a severed head or idol named Baphomet, and engaging in institutionalized sodomy. We must analyze why these specific charges were chosen. They were carefully engineered to be unforgivable. Financial corruption or greed were sins, but they were common. Heresy and idol worship, however, were existential threats to the Church. By confessing to spitting on the cross, the Templars admitted to being a cancer within Christendom. This narrative was designed to force the Pope's hand. How could the Pope defend a group that admitted to despising Christ? Of the 138 knights interrogated in Paris, nearly all confessed. Even the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, broken by age and fear, signed a confession. These confessions were then read aloud to the public in town squares, serving as a massive propaganda campaign. Philip was controlling the narrative, painting himself as the pious defender of the faith rooting out a satanic cult. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. The legal strategy was simple: manufacture guilt to justify the theft. The truth of the charges was irrelevant. The utility of the charges was everything. The desirable outcome for Philip was a debt-free kingdom, and the confessions were the currency he used to buy it. While Philip was running his propaganda campaign, Pope Clement V was frantically trying to regain control of the situation. History often remembers Clement as a weak puppet of the French king, but the discovery of the Chinon parchment in the Vatican secret archives in 2001 reveals a more complex financial and legal battle. This document proves that the Pope actually absolved the Templar leadership of heresy in 1308. Clement interviewed the Grand Masters at the castle of Chinon. He determined that while the Templars were guilty of corruption and strange initiation rituals, likely hazing designed to test blind obedience, they were not heretics. They were just weird, arrogant soldiers. The Pope's plan was to reform the order, not destroy it. He wanted to purge the rot, perhaps merge them with the Hospitallers, and keep their financial network intact under church control. He realized that destroying the Templars would set a dangerous precedent. Secular kings could seize church assets at will. However, Philip held all the cards. The Pope was essentially a prisoner in France, the beginning of the Avignon papacy. Philip threatened to put the Pope himself on trial for sodomy and heresy, specifically targeting the memory of the Pope's predecessor, Boniface VIII, if the Templars were not condemned. It was political blackmail. Philip made it clear: sacrifice the Templars, or I will destroy the legitimacy of the papacy. Clement capitulated. He suppressed the Chinon parchment, burying the absolution. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, he issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso, which officially dissolved the order. He didn't convict them based on law. He dissolved them based on administrative provision. He argued that the order's reputation was so ruined by the scandal that it could no longer function. It was a forced bankruptcy. The Pope tried to save face by ordering that Templar assets be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller rather than the king, but the damage was done. The Church had blinked, and the state had won. With the order dissolved, the Great Liquidation began. Theoretically, the papal bull ad providem transferred all Templar property to the Knights Hospitaller. In reality, the transfer was a logistical nightmare that Philip exploited to the fullest. This was the hostile takeover phase where the fees ate up the equity. Philip claimed massive expenses for the cost of imprisoning the Templars and conducting the trials over several years. He presented the Hospitallers with a bill that was astronomical. Before handing over the deeds to the Templar lands, the crown extracted every ounce of liquid wealth. The gold, silver, and jewels vanished into the royal treasury immediately. The Hospitallers inherited the land, but they also inherited the lawsuits, the maintenance costs, and the heavy transfer taxes imposed by the king. In England, King Edward II followed a similar, albeit slower, pattern. He initially didn't believe the charges, but when he realized the financial upside, he played along. The suppression of the Templars became a massive wealth transfer from the church to the secular states. It broke the back of independent financial power in Europe. For the Hospitallers, the acquisition of Templar estates made them wealthier on paper, but cash-poor in reality. It took them decades to litigate and secure control over the former Templar network. Meanwhile, the specialized financial infrastructure the Templars had built, the credit networks, the international clearings, collapsed. The European economy actually contracted. Without the Templars to facilitate large-scale capital movement, trade became riskier and slower. Philip got his quick cash infusion, but he destroyed the banking system that had fueled the economic expansion of the 13th century. It was a classic case of short-term gain for long-term economic pain. The saga concluded on March 18, 1314. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, and Geoffroy de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy, were brought out to the Isle de la Cite in Paris. They were expected to publicly confess one last time in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment. But in a final moment of defiance, de Molay went off script. Standing before the cardinals and the crowds, he retracted his confession. He shouted that the order was innocent, that the charges were lies, and that he was guilty only of betraying his order to save his own life. Philip acted instantly. He didn't wait for the church to hand down a sentence. He ordered them burned at the stake that very evening. As the flames rose, legend says de Molay shouted a curse, summoning Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to meet him before the tribunal of God within a year. Whether the curse was real or a literary invention, the timing was impeccable social proof for the superstitious minds of the era. Pope Clement V died of disease just a month later, on April 20th. King Philip IV suffered a stroke while hunting and died in November of the same year. The Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for centuries in an unbroken line of male heirs, collapsed shortly after. Philip's sons died young and without heirs, leading to the chaos of the Hundred Years' War. To the medieval public, this was divine retribution. It cemented the Templar myth. But from a historical perspective, it underscores the Pyrrhic nature of Philip's victory. He destroyed the bank to save his kingdom's finances, but his dynasty didn't survive to spend the money. The Knights Templar ceased to exist as an order, but their financial DNA survived. They had established the template for modern banking. The concepts they pioneered, branch banking checks, safe deposit boxes, and the separation of credit from physical currency, were picked up by the merchant banks of Italy, specifically the Bardi and Peruzzi families of Florence, who incidentally would also be bankrupted by lending to kings. There is also a compelling theory regarding the flight capital of the Templars. In the remote Alpine regions, which were nominally part of the Holy Roman Empire but fiercely independent, a new confederation was forming around this time, Switzerland. The founding of the Swiss Confederacy mimics the Templar structure. Cantons, like commanderies, bound by a pact of mutual defense. It is historically speculative but economically plausible that fleeing Templars, carrying their portable wealth and banking expertise, sought refuge in the Alps. This would explain the sudden rise of the Swiss as formidable heavy infantry, using tactics similar to the Templars, and, eventually, the rise of Switzerland as the world's private banking hub. The Swiss banking tradition of absolute secrecy, neutrality, and independence from foreign kings mirrors the Templar ethos perfectly. Whether or not individual knights fled there, the idea of the Templars, an entity that holds wealth securely, above the reach of nations, became the cornerstone of the Swiss financial model. They were the first to prove that he who controls the flow of money is more powerful than he who wears the crown, provided he stays in the shadows. The fall of the Knights Templar is the ultimate cautionary tale of finance. They were the first institution to become too big to fail, and because of that, they were destroyed. They forgot the most basic rule of power: wealth requires protection. The Templars had money, but they lacked political sovereignty. They relied on the imaginary protection of the church in a world that was becoming increasingly secular and ruthless. They failed to adapt. When the market changed, loss of the Holy Land, they didn't pivot. When the regulatory environment shifted, the rise of centralized monarchies, they didn't lobby or restructure. They remained arrogant. They allowed a single client, the King of France, to become over-leveraged, exposing them to systemic risk. Today, the spirit of the Templars lives on in every multinational bank that operates across borders, struggling with conflicting regulations and sovereign debt. But the lesson remains: when a financial institution becomes more powerful than the government that hosts it, the government will eventually strike back. The Templars built the road to modern capitalism, but they were paved over by it. The Templars were destroyed by a king who was broke. But what happens when the banks become the government? In our next file, we're going to Florence to look at the Medici family, the bankers who didn't just lend to popes, but bought the papacy itself. If you want to know how money really works, you have to follow the blood. Subscribe to Blood Money Files.